All right. Yeah. So, Sarah, why does the human brain have such a strong response to physical activity?
I guess the question is maybe why you wouldn't expect it to, because it's a physical thing. And I think sometimes we tend to think of, our brains and minds as somehow separate from our bodies, but of course they're not. So everything that affects the body is going to affect the brain because the brain is part of the body, right? So physical activity needs us to increase oxygen flow to our muscles. It increases blood flow. We need to get more fuel. And that allows more blood to flow around. That affects our brain directly. So as we increase kind of blood flow in general, that's going to impact our brain. Our breathing rate increases. We want to get more oxygen to our muscles. But that, of course, gives more oxygen in the blood, which goes to the brain. We're mobilizing fuel for our muscles to use, but that also goes to the brain. So all of these things affect our brain directly. And it used to be thought that that was why our brain was so affected by physical activity, that it was a kind of almost a side effect of the things that the rest of our body needed for physical activity. But then we realized that actually the brain was controlling all of these processes anyway. So the hormone releases that affect our ability to exercise are all directed by the brain anyway. So then people were thinking, oh, okay, so there's some interaction here. The brain seems to be controlling these processes, which makes sense. But then there's more of an evolutionary take on it too, which is that actually there's an intimate relationship between mental activity and physical activity. So from an evolutionary point of view, maybe there's actually a sort of real connection here. So I think there's lots of different levels that we can answer that question. Early humans, when we sort of came down from the trees and started to move around, we had to solve a whole load of sort of cognitive and mental tasks at the same time we were moving more and working out how to do, endurance, walking and running, traveling long distances, foraging. So we were kind of solving these tasks simultaneously. And David Raiklin, he's an anthropologist, he's kind of argued that our brains really have evolved to be engaged when we are active. So that there's a kind of evolutionary reason why we would expect, not just as a side effect, but why we would expect our brains to be kind of engaged by physical activity. Sorry, there's a whole load of words. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
No, you are. Yeah, you are. You definitely are. Okay, yeah, that's pretty interesting. So you mentioned that, the brain kind of like was wired to be cognitively engaged while we're in physical activity, right? Which is pretty interesting, because normally if you talk about feeling motivated, you normally only feel motivated after you move, right? It's hard to feel motivated if you're not doing anything, right? So I think, oftentimes, feeling inspired and stuff like that, it comes from being active. So that's really interesting. Now, one thing I want to talk about is like what actually happens though to the human brain when we adopt a sedentary lifestyle? Because obviously you mentioned having that oxygen flow, having your blood circulation and so on and so forth. But outside of that, like what happens to your brain when you stop being physically active?
Well, thinking about what we've just said, that if at some point physical activity has driven mental activity, and that's like a design feature, not an accidental relationship, then of course we would expect those positive effects to be reversed or neutralized or not happen when we're sedentary. So what seems to happen when we're physically active is we get changes in blood flow, which have positive effects. We get changes in oxygenation and fuel. We clear waste products out better. We also get a whole cascade of sort of chemical changes which affect various processes. And some of the most important of those are ones that support what's called neuroplasticity, which is how our neurons connect to each other, how flexible they are, whether they can make new connections. And that fundamentally supports memory and learning. In some creatures, we actually get neurogenesis. We get new neurons as well, but that's quite controversial in humans. We think it happens in some regions. But what that means is there's more possible capacity for learning as well. So if we're not active, one of the key changes is our sort of brain is not so well nourished. Inflammation tends to happen, which is a whole complicated story, but there's more inflammation, and that tends to be quite detrimental. And we tend to start losing connections. They're not stabilized, they're not maintained. And that gives us then less of a kind of capacity for potential future learning. So what we actually see if we're sedentary is we see the brain shrinks, we get less connections in the brain, we lose white matter, we can get volume loss, particularly in certain regions. We get less new neurons and less flexibility of our neurons, but we also get a whole load of other effects as well. So glucose metabolism gets changed. So we can become. That means we're getting less energy supply. We see changes in mitochondria, which are like the little energy creating units in our cells. We get changes in hormone levels, a reduction in some of the good ones, an increase in some of the bad ones. These can all affect motivation and mood. And we get changes in the gut as well. And the gut communicates massively with the brain. So changes in the gut can trigger inflammation in the brain. Inflammation in the brain is very negative. So there's this huge cascade of effects, some of which may be almost accidental and side effects, but some seem to be very, very direct. And they support this idea, perhaps, that what happens when we exercise is that our brain is sort of put into a more optimal state, if you like, for learning. But it also affects sort of mental health and mood regulation as well, because we actually need those capacities to solve some of the problems and some of the tasks.
Absolutely, yeah. So we will definitely talk about mood regulation and mental health. But one thing I want to quickly go a bit deeper on is this idea of neurogenesis, right? So you mentioned that when you engage in physical activity, you tend to stimulate neurogenesis, right? Which allows you to really like increase your capacity for learning. So can you go a bit deeper on that? Because I think that's extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. We used to think that neurons in the central nervous system didn't regenerate. And once you lost them, you lost them. And then probably about 20 years ago, we realized that some regions of the brain in some animals, and that's actually quite important, in some animals, in rodents, they started to realize that you get new neurons. So if you have mice and rats running, exercising, you can actually see the markers for new cells in certain areas in the brain, in the hippocampus in particular, and the olfactory cortex. And there's a huge amount of controversy as to whether this happens in adult humans or not. Some researchers are absolutely sure we get neurogenesis, the new cells. Some are less sure. So I think what we can definitely say is exercise increases neuroplasticity, but I think we probably need to be a little bit careful saying definitely adult neurogenesis in humans, although a lot of people do think the evidence points in that direction. So neuroplasticity in general is really about neurons' capacity for change, for new connections. So they're like they're little cell bodies with lots of axons and dendrites which connect to other cells into a network. So we definitely know we can grow new branches, which means new possible connections to other cells. And information, memories, any thinking, if you like, is represented in a sort of flow of information and activity in these networks. So we can definitely say neuroplasticity is increased very significantly by exercise. Possibly slightly wary about saying we do get new neurons in adult humans because we're not so sure.
Okay, so what makes them not so sure? Because I've heard of this, right? So like what exactly makes people a bit, I guess, to doubt, I guess, this idea of being able to increase your neurons through physical activity and so on and so forth? Like what's the main problem there?
I would have to wade through the research papers to find out, but it's very subtle and it's very hard. typically it's frowned upon to cut into the brains of live adult humans, so it's quite hard to do the research.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Obviously, some people would argue whether that's okay for rodents or not, but certainly it's harder to do. It's harder to do the research in humans. It's done with sort of staining cells, and then with a kind of dye or radioactive dye that will show up. So then you're trying to scan an adult brain, and it's just very hard to get the resolution. It's very hard to be sure. My understanding, I'd have to read the literature a bit more to be sure, but I think it's some of it is it's a very technical discussion as to what the data actually means. There's different research groups are interpreting some of the data that they see in a different way and saying, well, yes, maybe, but it could be this. And obviously with, a good scientific approach is to say, until we have a better theory, this is what we believe. And some groups are saying, we think it means this. And some groups are saying, we think it means this. It's really interesting work, I think. And I think the idea was kind of revolutionary when scientists realized that definitely in rodents and some other animals, we get new cells. But one of the reasons why it's theoretically possible that it's not the case in humans is because our brain is so much more complicated. Adding new cells might actually, so the theory goes, adding new cells might actually be something that would then sort of make existing networks not viable. So it might be that the sort of level of complexity of the human brain would mean that adding new cells would be sort of damaging in some way. So there may be a logic for new cells not being possible, but we're getting into very much sort of speculation here. Right?
Got it. Okay, no worries. Now you mentioned neuroplasticity, right? So just out of curiosity, what tends to stimulate that more? Is it strength training or a cardio-based workout? Like, what tends to stimulate that more?
I think so. Most of the research has been done with cardio stuff, simply because it's easier to get your rats running on a wheel. They love it. You stick a little hamster wheel in a cage, and they'll jump on it.
Got it.
So there's definitely more research about cardio stuff. Going back to that idea that there's a huge cascade of different responses that happen when we exercise. It looks like different chemicals, different substances, different effects come to different extents with different kinds of exercise. But certainly for the neuroplasticity, the work I've seen has most strongly associated with cardio stuff. Cardio work triggers something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is what gives the capacity for nerve cells to be plastic, as we're saying. It encourages growth of these possible connections, and may or may not in humans trigger new growth of cells as well, like neurogenesis. But certainly in rats and other rodents, cardio stuff triggers BDNF quite reliably.
Got it. Okay, great. All right, so let's just take a quick turn here. Now, one thing that you mentioned in your article, it might sound like a contradiction, right? But you mentioned that, human beings are kind of wired to try and conserve energy, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So why is that? And then also, because again, if being physically active is so healthy for us, why are we wired to conserve energy, right? So what's that relationship? If you can go a bit deeper on that, that'll be really interesting.
Yeah. Well, this is the really tricky thing, and this is, you might argue, this is a problem for us modern humans. We are wired to conserve energy, 100%. We're wired to eat when we get the opportunity. We're wired to be lazy when we get the opportunity. But we're also living in a world that we didn't evolve in. It's only been the last, couple of 100 years that the majority of people even had the opportunity for having access to enough food, never mind a huge amount of, high calorie food that's actually the cheapest food for many of us nowadays, and had the option of not moving. It's only since we've kind of mechanized the world to some extent that we're not having to go out and catch our food and, build our houses and, be active out in the fields. So we never had to evolve the need to exercise because it was not an option. So we didn't need a kind of evolutionary mechanism, a brain mechanism that made us move. We don't have, an intention to exercise because we didn't need to. We had to do that anyway. What I needed was something that stopped me wasting energy when I'd finished doing the useful things. So as long as I'm finding ways to protect myself, use myself. Sorry, you're laughing. It's really unfortunate for humans.
No, it's so interesting. Yeah, it's like it completely, backfired on us.
Well, absolutely, but it kind of makes sense. We're always having to deal with conflicts. I might want adventure, but I need ease as well. I might want to feel safe, but I want challenge. So we're always dealing with conflicts. But this one, we didn't need to have the balance in our own head. The world was providing that balance. I didn't have the option of moving. I had to move at least enough. I didn't have the option of overeating. So I want to be conserving energy when I can. But the reason why it's such a problem, so that's partly about our behavior. But so the problem is that we can conserve energy by moving less, by eating more. But we've also got what's called our resting metabolism. When I'm just sitting here doing nothing, if my body is sort of configured in certain ways, I'm going to be burning more calories than in other ways. So the real problem, even worse than what we've already spoken about, is we have this kind of use it or lose it mechanisms too. So another way of saving calories is if I burn less calories when I'm not doing anything. If I have muscle, I burn more calories. Muscle burns more calories than fat. So if I'm a muscly person sitting still or a fatter person sitting still with less muscle, the person with more muscle is burning more calories. So we understand this concept when it comes to sort of physical activity and its effects on our body. We lose capacity. If I don't need the muscles, I don't maintain them. I don't maintain my cardiovascular function. But unfortunately, the same thing happens with the brain. So if I am sedentary and I'm not getting these sort of drivers to maintain capacity, to maintain hormone levels, to manage things well, I lose it. And we actually see, again, when we're sedentary, we lose brain tissue. We we see changes which are, it's sort of analogous to losing muscle in our bodies. We lose capacity in our brain, and we see changes in hormone levels. We see changes in responsiveness to insulin, inflammation, and they're all. It seems like without the driver of exercise, we don't maintain a sort of optimal brain state in a way. And the real kicker is as these levels come down, because some of them, like dopamine in particular, drives motivation. We end up with less motivation to move as well as everything else. So we get into these kind of spirals. Without those crucial neurotransmitters, we've got less motivation to move, and that further decreases serotonin and dopamine that make us feel okay. And of course, that impacts physical and mental health. So it's an unfortunate environmental, sort of evolutionary mismatch, really. We're designed
exactly
well, but not for now.
Mm-hmm.
that's the problem.
Yeah, exactly. So it seems like our pattern of behavior nowadays, right? It doesn't align with how we evolved, right? So it tends to really interrupt again our natural process, right? Like we never evolved to sit down, right? Like sitting down in chairs the way we do for multiple hours on end, like that's just not a thing, right? So it just seems like
we are designed to rest when we can. But yes, you're right. Mm-hmm. Actually, the sort of the people who we think are most similar today to those sort of foraging, hunting folks, they do tend to rest more actively as well, weirdly. So you're right, it's not sitting on a chair with all muscles kind of collapsed. They might be sort of more crouching or kneeling, just a little bit more active even in resting state. And it's actually quite interesting because we don't need a vast amount of exercise. Those guys move more than us. But we're talking about something like, a factory worker who's constantly on his feet, not necessarily, running a marathon every day. So that active resting makes quite a lot of difference. And also they
Absolutely.
have higher basal metabolism in general because they typically have lower levels of fat and higher levels of muscle. So the calorie burn is different as well. So it's complicated.
Got it. Okay, yeah, that's great. So let's just talk a bit more about like the benefits that come with exercise on a person's brain. Okay, so in your article, you mentioned that recent research is clear that many of the exercise related chemical factors produced by the muscles, bones, liver, and other tissues also target the brain directly, right? So what chemical factors are we talking about here? And again, what kind of training tends to stimulate that more? Again, is it more cardio or strength?
You keep asking that tricky question, but it's actually quite
Yeah,
hard to
yeah,
answer.
yeah. It is. It is. I know.
So yes, I mean that research seems pretty clear. They're called in the literature. They're called exokines. They're sort of signaling substances that get released in response to exercise that affect other systems than the one they've come from, and lots of systems that are affected by exercise seem to release these factors which actually can affect the brain. And this was a bit of a surprise. And it was only about 10 years ago, I think, for most of them, when we realized that actually they could cross the brain barrier. So the brain is protected from the rest of the bloodstream by something called the blood-brain barrier, which stops, potentially dangerous things getting into the brain. But some chemicals do cross, but a lot of things don't, and it's sort of to keep the brain safe. And until fairly recently, researchers didn't realise that a lot of these chemicals actually could cross into the brain. So if they can cross into the brain, they can do something when they get there. But if they get kind of bounced off, if you like, it doesn't really matter if they're circulating in the body because they're not going to affect the brain. So I just pulled out a few today. I had a bit of a look before I came online, and there's chemicals from muscles, from bones, from the liver, which seem to be almost designed to target the brain. And when they get there, they do all sorts of things. So some of the ones that are of most interest is something called irisin, and that seems to affect BDNF, which is that chemical that increases neuroplasticity. So that's these are produced from the muscles, I think. We've got things that are released during sort of particularly endurance exercise, just going back to your question of what kinds of exercise.
Yeah.
We've got ones that seem to be produced in response to particularly weight-bearing exercise, or a particular kind of intense short-term exercise. So there seems to be the different types or components of exercise seem to differentially target some of these systems. So you've got some that are produced from the liver, and then that's going to be in response to the amount of fuel available in the body at a particular time, and it's going to affect that. Some of those affect, I've got memory. Again, it's BDNF that gets affected. And there's a really interesting one that comes from the bones. And again, that's very much to do with weight-bearing exercise. It's a chemical that until recently people thought was concerned with, I believe, the kind of crystalline bone structure in bones themselves. But where it passes over into the brain, it seems to be involved in a huge amount of systems, particularly ones that, again, affect memory. And that one in particular seems to be affected, potentially of interest in terms of age-related cognitive decline, so dementia, and sort of conserving the if you like, the volume of brain tissue. So I think it's probably too early to say what, if there's an optimal dose of different kinds of exercise. My understanding, just looking in from the outside, is that probably the best way to think about it is just move in lots of different ways, do lots of different things. It's a mixture of things. Probably there's a whole load of separate systems which are affected more or less by different activities. But maybe if we were just all moving in a much more sort of natural for evolutionary humans way, maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need to be sort of thinking almost like of a specific diet of exercises. It's just if we were moving in the way we used to, we would sort of hit all of these things.
God. Okay, yes, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, because I keep asking that question because strength training and cardio, it's two completely different types of working out, right? So what you're saying is that more than, I guess, focusing on the type of exercise, just focus on moving on a consistent basis the way that we used to as we evolved, right? So it's not necessarily about, I guess, trying to do push-ups or chin-ups or jog for 5 miles. What you're basically saying is just move consistently and don't be stagnated and sit down all day long. Like that's, I guess, kind of the main idea here.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to come back to this, but I think one of the difficulties is that a lot of us find it really hard to move enough, and probably that's the problem to nail before we worry about the details. A little bit like, if you have a junk diet, you don't want to worry about supplements. You want to be eating more fruit and veg. So I think the very first response to that would be, for most of us, moving more is probably a good place to start. I had a quick look before I came online. I think 50% of folks in Canada don't meet the kind of minimum recommended activity levels, and it's the same in most developed countries, most countries actually in the world. So I think the problem to nail is probably just either making it necessary or making it enjoyable, and not worrying too much about what we do to begin with. It's more important to be moving. And then actually from that, build up. If we want to sort of take the next step, maybe just make sure it's a variety. It's probably not about, I don't know, just hitting your cardio max or whatever, but do this kind of thing, and lots of other bits and pieces. Weight, I mean, broadly speaking, you've got cardio stuff, you've got weight bearing stuff, and then a really interesting set of like mind body stuff. So stretching or Tai Chi, Pilates, yoga, those kind of ones seem to offer something quite different as well. So broadly speaking, I think there's these sort of 3 categories, and if we do a bit of all of those, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
But probably just doing more for at least half of us. Just doing just doing more, and that in itself is a big enough problem, which we have some thoughts about as well.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Okay, yep, I got it. All right, now something else that I also want to speak about is this idea of an exercise pill, right? So in your article, you mentioned that these chemical factors that you just mentioned, in the future, it could be used to make a pill that people take if they want to make sure their brain health is protected, right? Now, here's the thing. Do you think a pill could actually be as effective as exercise? Because with exercise, obviously, you're going to naturally produce these chemicals, right? Like, do you really think a pill could match that? No.
Simple answer.
And why is that?
I'm not an expert researcher in that particular area. I'm sort of a neuroscientist and a psychologist and a therapist. But the reason I said that was because some of that work's been done, but I don't think the idea really is an exercise pill that will hit all the things that exercise does. I think there's kind of two main focuses on that work, as I understand it. I think the aim for some of the researchers is to identify and maybe isolate some of the chemicals triggered by exercise that can then address specific health problems. So, for example, can we find some of the components that might improve dementia or heart disease, diabetes? And some of these have mental health components. But I think the idea of an exercise pill to begin with is maybe much more focused on physical diseases or difficulties. So the idea was, for someone maybe who can't exercise, maybe is bedridden, maybe is having cancer treatment, and can't exercise. Is there something we can do that would help prevent the losses that we see in response to a lack of exercise? So I think the idea of an exercise pill, so-called, of course, it's not really an ideal name, but I think it's
hypothetically,
Yeah, I think it's more targeted at the idea of picking out some of the components and then using those to treat certain disorders. And there are drugs around already which attempt to do this. Some of them have been banned for athletes, so that probably means they work. So they're kind of trying to use some of the information that we know about how say our muscles burn fuel and almost turn up the volume, which gives athletes a better endurance, or things that promote weight loss. Interestingly, so things like Ozempic, is it Ozempic and Mounjaro, and those drugs, they actually, in a way, they're probably not classed as exocrines because it's not exactly the same. It's not the same as the natural hormone that we produce, but they produce something which does increase something called GLP-1, GLP-1, which actually is increased in exercise. So it's a hormone that suppresses appetite. So I don't think they would be classed as exocrines, but in a way they're sharing a similar kind of idea, which actually naturally when we exercise we increase the levels of these appetite suppressing hormones. So they're using that as a bit of an analog. They're doing something very, very similar. And there are some chemicals being explored for dementia, which is more related to sort of our topic today. But of course the GLP-1 drugs, the weight loss drugs, they're increasingly looking like they're having a positive effect on mental health for many people. And we think that might be because they're also reducing brain inflammation, which has this really positive effect on lots of other systems. It tends to preserve neuron health. So mood shifts seem to be happening with those things. I think what I always come back to is the fact that it's just so complicated. Every system seems to affect everything. We talk about something like exercise, and it's affecting a myriad of systems. Both sort of outside of the brain and inside the brain, but they're almost not separable. There's so much stuff going on. I don't think we'll have an exercise pill that does all the job. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Okay, so basically what you're saying is, if there are some sort of pills that are developed, it's going to be more specific for like a certain type of issue, or if you're completely bedridden, to help people in those states as well.
Exactly.
Right? Not
I think it's more specific than a pill that targets everything that exercise does. It's either going to be pulling out some of those components, or it's going to be to try and offset some of the worst effects for people who can't exercise.
Got it. Okay, great. Yep, got it. Now, obviously, one of the most common topics that people talk about is how exercise is really good at preventing brain disease and keeping a sharper mind, right? So we just spoke about how, right now, I guess there isn't really anything that can genuinely replace natural exercise. So what makes it so good at keeping a sharper mind and making sure that people don't end up with a brain disease to, like a certain extent? Yeah.
Well, there's a question. I mean, to some extent, some of the things we've said already are an answer to that. It looks like exercise. One of the reasons why exercise is so important is because of this effect on neuroplasticity, which is basically the flexibility of possible connections in our brain. And without exercise, we tend to get less plasticity, and over time we get less connections too, so we actually lose matter. So from the point of view of preventing sort of neurodegenerative diseases, what we're talking about there is the loss of brain structure, fundamentally the loss of brain cells. And it's then harder to learn because we don't have the capacity anymore. So I think in some ways this idea that exercise particularly triggers BDNF, it's that again. It's the stuff that maintains, but it's everything that goes with that. It's increased blood flow, improving neuronal health. It's reduced inflammation that improves neuronal health. And then there's a whole set of other chemicals which help us with focus, which help sort of executive function, which is our ability to kind of manage tasks and plan. And going back to David Raiklin's idea that exercise and sort of mental abilities probably co-evolved, his argument was that actually activity in our past, in our evolutionary past, would be associated with cognitive tasks. That would be when we were in new environments or learning new things or needing new skills. So that, again, this sort of co-evolution of our, if you like, cognitive abilities, our abilities to think and plan and strategize and manage ourselves as well. So the kind of mental health side of regulation, how do I carry on when this is really hard work and, I'm bored and, whatever. So that all of these things come together so that there certainly seems to be, we could certainly make a case that exercise seems to underpin these capacities. We see changes in brain systems, connectivity between regions. We see different levels of hormones in different regions that manage some of these sort of brain responses. So there's a huge amount of different mechanisms that seem to underpin a sort of thinking skills, if you like, and planning skills, as well as the mental health side of our mood and our regulation, our inabilities to sort of manage ourselves as well.
God, yeah. So obviously, there's a lot of stuff that it covers, right? But
absolutely,
yeah, it does. Yeah, exactly. So, but one thing that you mentioned is that it helps you really move forward when you're going through tough things, right? Like, how do I carry on, right? And this kind of relates to something else that you talk about in your article is, one's ability to learn how to emotionally, like regulate, right? And you talk about how physical endurance helps with this concept, which is extremely important because, being able to handle your emotions is probably one of the most important skills of all time, right? If you want to live a good life. So why does physical endurance help a person's, like their ability to understand and analyze and just fully regulate their emotions?
I think that is a really fundamental question, and I think in a weird way it's one that we've kind of lost. I'm going to go all a bit philosophical here, but it kind of, our modern lives are too easy in some ways. We don't ever have to. We're never like up against it physically. If it's a bit cold, I'll put the heating on, and if I'm out in the rain, I'll go and hop into a restaurant. And it's kind of like we seem to have lost, a lot of us, if we don't put ourselves by choice in those situations, we don't have to be in those situations. And it's the kind of what the old Scout movement was about. It's kind of challenge in the mountains and kind of learning resilience. And I think sort of separate from some of the things we've been talking about so far, I think there's certain there are things that we learn from overcoming difficult things, and physical activity is actually a perfect vehicle for that. Whether it's, I don't know, pushing through in the gym and lifting more weight than I ever have, or whether it's up a mountain with a backpack and battling the weather. And I think the things we learn about ourselves and about what's important are massively powerful. And in terms of how that might sort of be shown, if you like, in the brain, we know the effects of physical exercise, so we kind of create this sort of ideal medium for learning, if you like. But what we're also needing to do, again, thinking from an evolutionary point of view, if I'm foraging, if I'm doing what's called persistence hunting, where you're basically tailing an animal for a long time. Before we invented fancy equipment for killing animals, we just tail them until they're tired. That kind of endurance hunting, we have to manage our own endurance too. We have to find ways and systems to manage our mood and our exhaustion and our boredom and cold. We're also maybe working in groups. We are maybe feeling reassured by people around us. We're planning, we're organizing. So all the emotional regulation stuff is part of our executive function, is part of our ability to get things done. If I'm going to hunt the animal, it's not just about my planning and organization to hunt the animal. I'm also going to need to regulate myself. So certainly some of the anthropologists would argue that these sort of self-regulation abilities were just as important as the, if you like, the more logical thinking skills. Does that answer your question? I feel like I'm
Yeah, it
slightly
does. It does. No, it's fine. It's fine. Like, I mean, obviously, it's not an easy topic, right? Like, it's pretty complicated, but it is something that I really agree with, because what I realize is, as a kid, I played many sports, right? And there was nothing that honestly challenges you and forces you to grow, like doing 500 reps of something, or trying to run 10 miles. Like, there's nothing that challenges you more than that. I mean, obviously, if you train to build strength or um, build muscle, that's great, right? But to be honest, it doesn't force you to grow internally, like long runs do, or 500 reps. Like,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely,
because you're constantly having this conversation with yourself, right? Because you want to quit, like you want to quit, but then yeah, you have to. So like you pretty much have to find ways, like where can you go, like mentally, if you want to keep moving forward, right? So
absolutely.
like that's one way to, I guess, somewhat replicate, as you called, persistence hunting, right? Because you just had to keep
Absolutely.
on going in some way, shape, or form, right? Because like it kind
Absolutely.
of, yeah, I mean, obviously that's a whole new, like if you're trying to persistence on, there's so many different skills involved, like shooting and planning and working with
Exactly.
teammates and so on and so forth. But the internal challenge of just constantly moving forward, there's nothing that does that better than cardio or high rep work. So when you mentioned that in your article, I was like, it's a factual statement that no one really speaks about for some reason.
Absolutely. I think some of the most important experiences in my life have been from, I used to do a lot of long distance backpacking. So I'd be carrying
Oh, okay.
heavy
Yeah.
heavy rucksack for, tens of miles. And keeping it together, managing the weather, getting through the cold, the exhaustion, and keeping it together so that you're still choosing a decent place to camp, and you're making sure you're facing the right way in the weather, and you've got to manage your kit, because if you don't, it's going to be a nightmare tomorrow. And you know but as well as all that, you then get such massive rewards, because there's nothing more delicious than, I don't know, water when you finally get it, when you haven't had it for a while.
Yeah,
Or,
yeah,
that
yeah,
bit of rubbish pasta that's been in the bottom of your rucksack and you finally cook it and
yeah,
eat it. Or
yeah.
just sitting down. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it also kind of cuts through the noise almost of what is important and what isn't important. So I think there's that kind of very sort of psychological component of it. But as I say, what the anthropologists would argue is that our regulation abilities sort of grew in response to these new demands. So I think, actually, funny enough,
Wow.
sport is something that seems to, it's the only exception to that idea of rest being the priority in humans. Young animals, they all play, and it's ability to learn skills. So we can see that it's still, it's not a waste of energy, if you like, because I'm still learning skills. But in humans, we continue sometimes to play sport, and sport, it would be argued, is almost like you say, it's the perfect, if you like, modern day version of being active, persisting, teamwork, planning, flexible thinking. Like, oh my God, that guy's stronger than me, so I'm going to do something different. Or, oh, someone dropped it, so now I'm going to change kind of almost my plan. Thinking on the spot, managing my exhaustion because I don't want to let the team down. In some ways, it feels like the perfect task. So when we think a little bit more about, what is the best kind of exercise for us, I think we shouldn't just be thinking in terms of the actual physical activity. What the anthropologists would quite clearly argue is it's not. It's the interaction of activity and, if you like, the tasks we're doing at the time. And something like team sports, for many people, might be, a sweet spot, if you like, because it's challenging a lot of these cognitive skills at the same time. And if we want to build brain capacity, we don't just want to sort of create the conditions, like the plasticity. We also want to stabilize it. So we want to use it for something as well. And that is what's going to sort of, I guess, maintain that pace. There's no point just creating the possibility of learning if we're not then also learning.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So like this does remind me because again, if you do play sport, you'll hear the catchphrase. It's like, oh, you have to suffer if you want to grow, right? So sometimes when you're young, you might be like, yo, like this guy's just trying to, he's just trying to say that to, try and inspire me, right? But based on your work, like to be honest, there is like a real evolutionary reason for that, right? You have to, because like we were wired for that, right? Without that, you're not going to be able to learn how to emotionally handle things, which is it's such an interesting idea for me. Now, when it comes
Yeah,
down
I mean,
to yeah,
to a point, I think we can go too
yeah,
far
yeah, not
with
too
pain.
much. Yeah, of
Too
course,
much
of
pain,
course.
probably no gain
Yeah,
at
yeah, and then
all.
yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, there's a certain limit, of course, there
There is.
definitely is.
Yeah,
Now one other aspect of being able to emotionally regulate is having confidence, right? Because what you'll notice is if you have low confidence, your ability to handle your emotions is not going to be there, right? And if you
absolutely,
have high confidence, you will notice that your ability to handle issues and go through
absolutely,
emotions is like you're much more exactly like you're much more mature with it, right? Now,
absolutely.
what is it about exercise that builds confidence? Is it the actual results? Is it the endorphins? Is it the idea of like overcoming challenges? What is it about that source that builds confidence?
I'm glad you asked that because I think what you said about confidence in a way changes how we interact with the world. It changes what we see and how we respond to things. I think that's absolutely the way of thinking about it. A lot of people, it's almost like we feel that confidence comes because the world's been okay to us or because we've been all right. But there is this kind of two way conversation. So in terms of what people get from exercise, I imagine there's probably as many answers as there are people. But certainly there are some sort of themes, which, I mean, one of them is, in a way, what we've been talking about, a sense of achievement, challenge, overcoming, thinking of myself as someone who can, commit to something and maybe make progress. That's quite powerful in itself. Um, if I am someone who, just lifted that weight this week that I couldn't lift a month ago, or I managed to keep up with my friends when I'm running. Well, that's like a new story for me. If I'm someone who before that hadn't felt that confident or hadn't felt that capable. So again, it's that idea of exercise as a good vehicle for learning things, which is a little bit different from, if you like, the direct effects, biological effects on the brain. But in a way, they're not separable anyway. But I think these kind of psychological ideas are really important. A lot of people talk about when I'm moving or in motion, it kind of interrupts my normal thoughts. So maybe if my normal thoughts are less positive and now I'm focusing on something else, that in itself can be massively important. And that kind of gives space for
Mm,
learning new things, which again, it might give me space to kind of go, oh, actually, do you know what? I'm not doing so badly after all. That's okay. But there's something else which
mm,
I think is a really interesting idea. And it's this idea of what we call interoception. So we're always looking out there in the world and paying attention to what's around us. But we're less aware that our brain is constantly monitoring how our body is doing as well. So we're always, our brain is always processing
mm,
signals of, am I starving? Am I dehydrating? Am I feeling strong? Am I feeling capable? Am I in pain? And of course, as we get physically fitter, in general, some of the signals coming back from the body to the brain are going to be saying, "Oh, man, yeah, I'm feeling pretty good today. I'm not hurting today. I'm not aching. I'm feeling stronger. And that in itself is a very good foundation for feeling more confident. If I'm going through my day feeling like, oh, do you know what? I'm doing okay today, or
mm,
yeah, I can lift that bag. It's not so exhausting. I can
mm,
walk to work without feeling tired. I'm actually going to just feel better about myself because some of those, if you like, basic signals that my brain is registering is that I'm okay. So there is this idea of interoception as being like the almost setting the mood of the day, um, and how feeling stronger and more capable physically would influence that sort of mental soundtrack, if you like. I think we don't really pay attention to that, but I think it's super important. And of course, the other thing is motivation.
Yeah.
If exercise increases some of these hormones which help us feel happier or calmer or less stressed, then, like you were saying, if I'm feeling better going through my day, what happens to me in my day is going to impact me differently. If I'm feeling capable and something goes wrong, it's like, oh, okay, fine, I'll just fix it. If I'm not feeling capable, or I'm already feeling grumpy or stressed, and something goes wrong, I'm going to lose it potentially. And that then is going to give me all these defects that I can't cope and I can't do this, and the world's out to get me, which isn't very helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
And stress management is the big thing. So in a way, what exercise really does, which is really important, is it kind of it gives us a way of practicing dealing with stress. So when you think about our stress response, we talk about the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. It's physiological readiness for action. If I need to fight or run away, it's kind of that readiness for action. And when we start moving, when we start exercising or being active, it triggers the same or almost identical cascade of physical changes. But it's in this context where we know we're not in danger. We're not reading it as stress. But our body is forced to kind of coordinate a whole load of communication in our brain about this stress response. And actually that, it's highly likely that is one of the biggest effects. If I improve my ability to regulate, maybe turn the signals off better, my stress system becomes less jumpy, if you like, then I'm going to constantly read my day in a different way, in a better way. So this sort of relationship between the response to exercise and our responses to non-exercise related stresses, the idea that activity just gives us this new context for almost learning how to deal with this. I think that's a really interesting idea as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned a lot there, right? Stress management,
sorry.
motivation. No, that's fine. That's good. It's really good. And then, it's pretty interesting. So you mentioned that your mind is constantly, trying to moderate, trying to, see how your body is responding to certain situations. So you know how they normally say that there's a mind-body connection, right? So technically, I guess if you want to regulate your mind, I guess have to start with the body, because I guess if you relax your body, then I guess your mind will kind of get a signal. Is that correct? Or
yeah, in a way. And it's why that third area of activities that we mentioned, we talk about cardio, weight stuff, and these sort of so-called mind-body exercises, where we are much more conscious of the connection. Maybe we're deliberately breathing and doing certain activities together. It can help us build that kind of interoception. It can help us be more aware of what's going on in a really helpful way. And it's both ways. Our brain can control some of these mechanisms. A lot of the time, these mechanisms are unconscious and we're not aware of them. But we have sort of signaling pathways that go both directions. So there's a bit of an interesting trick, which is we share most of these stress responses with other animals right down the kind of evolutionary scale. But we assume that they are not capable of choosing to control the breathing rate. So one of the signals the brain gets is how fast we're breathing. But of course, we can control that consciously as a human. So when we are deliberately slowing down our breathing rate, what we're actually doing is we're actually signaling to our brain that it was okay. The stress response has come down, even if it's not true. But what that then means is the brain can help us calm down. So it's a little bit like we've sort of slightly hacked the system. Sorry, we're getting slightly off the main topic here. But I think the point is that these interoceptive signals, they do affect how our brain then responds, or how we respond to the incoming world, if I'm feeling capable. then
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be more capable. So these sort of third
Exactly.
set of sort of exercises, if you like, they kind of help with that maybe more deliberate focus on this interoception side of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And then obviously, you just slowly learn to really trust yourself, right? Because obviously, when you engage in exercise and you start, for example, building muscle or building strength, or if you get better get better at a skill set, what you're really showing yourself is, through effort you can grow, right? And then that
Absolutely.
allows you to trust yourself, and without that you're not going to have any confidence or motivation, because if you don't believe you could change anything, then you're not going to get
Absolutely.
motivated, right? So you're hitting like multiple birds with one stone, which is pretty interesting.
Absolutely. With the
Yeah.
really, really interesting side effect that as you do it,
Mm-hmm.
you increase
Mm-hmm.
your capacity for motivation too, which is,
Exactly.
the big reward in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Sarah, unfortunately, our time is slowly coming to an end here. We have like 2 minutes left. I really enjoyed this one. This is obviously a pretty complicated topic. So yeah, if people want to learn more about this topic, where can they find your work? And do you have, like any books that you would recommend for people to go and read if they want to learn more about this topic?
So I have one just here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
um, so the one I've been reading just recently is this one, which is Lieberman's
Oh,
Exercise.
exercised.
He's
Got it.
he's he's the guy who kind of points out many things, but he's very interested in this: how do we motivate ourselves to exercise when we're not, like you said, we're not really designed to want to. So but he
Mm-hmm.
talks a lot about evolutionary reasons and these kind of connections. What's going on at the moment? So that's something I'm currently quite enjoying. In
Got
terms
it.
of my work, I have a blog on Psychology Today, which I think is where you came across my article. And there's
Absolutely.
2 or 3 on there which are related to exercise. So you just find me as Sarah Gingell on Psychology Today. And I am actually thinking of running some workshops on exercise and anxiety, actually. So if people were interested, they could contact me directly, because my intention is to put some kind of teaching sessions together, because I think it's just such a fascinating subject. And I think the more I
Yes.
learn about sort of mental health, even as a therapist, I think a lot of our mental health depends on lifestyle. Fundamentally, we've been talking about exercise today, but also what we eat and how we eat, sleep. It's all these really basic things. It's a little bit like the building blocks. They don't guarantee we'll be okay. But if you don't have good bricks, it's going to be much harder to build something really positive on top of it. So I think,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think personally, for me, I think this is just such a fascinating subject. And what the research shows is that for things like depression and anxiety, exercise is as effective, if not more effective, than the medications that are available. But of course, the difficulty is to get people to move, particularly if
Yeah.
you're feeling low. It's the hardest. So
Yeah. Got it. And then do you do like any other work outside of this, or is this, I guess, kind of like your main domain?
no, I'm a therapist. I work as a counsellor. So that's my main job. I was originally an academic, studied memory and learning, actually, and
Mm.
sort of neuroscience and psychology was my background, and then I've retrained
Oh, got it.
as a therapist. So I work as a counsellor at the moment, which I really enjoy.
Got it. Yeah, that's good. If you can send me, like all your links, I'll just post it down below, and people can, go and check it out if need be.
Okay, I'll do that.
Okay, then. Yeah, well, Sarah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and maybe one day we can do round number 2 and go a bit deeper on more topics.
Okay, all
All
right,
right,
that sounds fantastic. Thank you.
all right.
It's
Yeah,
been
no
great to be on.
problem. Thank you so much. It's been amazing. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.